yours over again. I want to say something about the staff here. Have any of, I'm sure some of you, how many of you have done karma yoga in the centers and seen the staff? Almost everybody. That's wonderful. Because when I went to study with Swami Vishnu Devananda, I wanted to learn how to stand on my head and control my breathing, which I'm sure brought a lot of you here as well. I found that in the end to be one of the least significant parts of yoga. I knew nothing about Jnana Yoga, Raja Yoga, Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, etc. And realized that what we know here in the West, the Hatha Yoga, the asanas that we see, you know, it's a very visual representation of yoga, somebody standing on their head. It's different. We have a culture now that glorifies youth and vitality and exercise, and of course that's what attracts many people. But in the long run, what has meant the most to me is seeing the people like the staff who just got introduced and the others here, giving of themselves selflessly. I don't know if many of you know about their wonderful employment package. They get no pay, no pension, no vacation. They work there are times when they work 16 hours a day, when TTC is coming together. Very often they do very little sleep. They have no, I think I said they have no health care insurance, no life insurance, no golden parachutes. And everybody pretty much does everything. And by that I mean one day they'll cook, the next day they're cleaning toilets. The next day they're teaching, or the same day very often, they're teaching a yoga class and leading a satsang. And this, in today's materialistic world, this is not what I was asked to talk about, by the way. So sorry, I'll try to get to that. How much, give me sort of a heads up at some point, like 10 minutes, 5 minutes. I'd like to answer questions too. When we run out of time, I'll be downstairs and you can ask me questions. One of my favorite people in the organization was a very small Jewish woman named Ruby Blue. Do any of you know her? One. She was a high-polluting, high-society Jewish lady who lived in the Watergate Towers next to the Attorney General, John Mitchell. In fact, his Secret Service people came over one day, knocked on her door, and said, "Miss Blue, you need to move the planters on your balcony." Turns out her sons were growing pot next to the Attorney General. She had no idea. At any rate, her story, I've been reading, this is a wonderful book called The Yogi, about the life of Swami Vishnu Devananda. And in it are many stories about his disciples, students, followers coming to him and how they met him and how they got drawn into this kind of loving service, and how, you know, he started out with literally nothing, maybe $2 a carpet bag, standing on the runway at an airport, and ended up with this center and all of you being here tonight. Ruby went about the same time I did. I started at this center almost exactly 45 years ago. The center started 50 years ago. And it's interesting that I was invited to help celebrate the 50th anniversary. The message didn't get to me. I ended up being here on Swami's Mahasamadhi Day, the day he passed on. At any rate, Ruby went to the yoga campus. I did. I don't know what she wanted, I guess, to learn to stand on her head. And she approached the Swami, I think, to introduce herself and in a group of people, and he immediately pointed at her and says, "You, take out the garbage." And she fell in love with him immediately and served him into her 90s, teaching, among other things, she was one of his most faithful devotees, eventually became a Swami and taught yoga. The last time I saw her, she was around 25 years old. 95 years old, still teaching yoga at Gold's Gym and pushing everybody in Washington, D.C., by the way. Now, one of the things that I thought today about being asked to speak about my relationship with Swami Vishnudevananda, I thought that we live in really, really amazing times today. Imagine, if you will, being able to hear and see Christ, Moses, Muhammad, Guru Nanak, etc. The idea is pretty much beyond comprehension. In fact, what we do see is, instead of seeing Moses, we see Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. And they're coming out with a new version of that. I don't know who's going to play Moses. The amazing thing today is that, number one, for me it's amazing that I got to spend time with and be in the presence of and talk to and be taught by a person like Swami Vishnudevananda, and through him got the teachings of Sivananda, and ended up going with Swamiji to Rishikesh, where the whole shebang started with Swami Sivananda. I also arrived at the yoga camp at a time when a lot of the Sivananda students, like Satchidananda, was there, who started Yogaville in Virginia, Venkatesananda, who had an ashram in Mauritius, and also, of course, Chidananda, who's still running the Divine Life Society. And each one of those people embodied a different type, one of the different yogas. Chidananda, I'd say, was a Raja Yogi. Venkatesananda was a Jnana Yogi. Swamiji was very, very, very definitely, he was one of the greatest proponents and greatest teachers ever of Hatha Yoga. Chidananda was a beautiful example of Bhakti Yoga, etc. So it was an incredible time. And in my last two talks, which some of you are here for, I talked about synchronicity. And somebody asked me what I learned from my trip with Swamiji, and I'd never thought of the question. It never occurred to me. I just kind of tend to live life as it comes without thinking a lot about why or how or what I learned from it. So it's an interesting question. And I said that one of the things that I learned was that fear is overrated. And the interesting thing today is that I opened your Facebook page, perhaps, or the Center's Facebook page, and the first thing on it, I also talked about the importance of being here and now, and that I don't think it's a coincidence that all of us have come here today to be together now. So I talked about synchronicity, the uselessness of fear, or the overratedness of fear, about how times, in fact, when I met when I first came to the center, I was going through a personal crisis, and I remember one of the things that buoyed my spirits was George Harrison's, Paul McCartney's song, in times of troubled waters. Mother Mary came to me with words of wisdom, let it be, let it be. Then I get invited here to speak at Swami's Mahasamadhi, and ended up the day, 2 days before, at a conference with a friend of mine, and who was there but Paul McCartney singing that song, which I found very, very amazing. I mean, again, one of those coincidences. At any rate, I looked at the Facebook page, and it has a beautiful picture of Swamiji, and under it is this quote: "The commitment we need to make is to live in the present moment, to give up living in the past. It means controlling the tendency we have to live in a fantasy world in which we use imagination to create a defense against suffering." And that, by the way, reminded me of another quote. It's by a Dutch theologian. I can't give you the name, and I can't quote it in Dutch. There was a woman here from one of the staff from Amsterdam who might have been able to, but she's had to go back. This was told to me by a psychiatrist I was working with, Rolfing actually, which sometimes is a little bit painful. And he grimaced like I was hurting him, and I said, "Is that okay?" He says, "No, no, it's fine." He says, and he gave me this quote, which was, "We suffer the most from our fear of suffering." And I think that's what Swamiji here is talking about, because we're afraid of suffering, which everybody does, by the way. Is there anybody here who is not? I thought somebody was going to raise their hand. I'm going to bring them up here to speak. In fact, there's a wonderful story about the Buddha. A woman came to him absolutely distraught. Her son had died. And she had heard that he was a holy man who could do miracles, and she went to him asking that he bring her son back. Could he please do this? And he said, "Yes, I will." I said, "I need you to do something, though, to help me do that. I need you to go and get the ashes from the fireplace of 3 homes who have never lost anybody." And she went from house to house to house to house, and after some period of time, a month, 6 months, came back to him and said, "I understand now." Meaning that there's nobody who has not lost somebody, there's nobody who has not suffered. At any rate, I'll try to get on the topic about my relationship with Swamiji, and which is hard. I talked last Sunday about frogs and ice cream and incense. I guess today it's elephants. I could talk about turtles all the way down. That's another story. I'm getting a no. How many here do not know the story of the blind man and the elephant? And don't be ashamed of raising your hand, because that'll give me a chance to tell it. Oh my God, a lot of people. Good. Which reminds me of another elephant story. I'm amazed that many people don't know it, because it's a very commonly told teaching story. Blind men there were, I think, 7 blind men walking through the jungle and holding on to each other's robes so that they wouldn't get separated. And they come into a clearing. In the clearing is an elephant, and they literally ran into it, and they didn't know what it was in their way, because they knew the path, and they'd taken it daily, and all of a sudden there's an obstruction. And they'd start feeling it and start explaining what's in their way. And one of them says, it's a wall. He's feeling the side. Another one is feeling the trunk, and he says, no, it's a hose. Another one has felt the leg, and he says, no, it is a tree, it's a stump. Another one's feeling the tail, and he says, you're all wrong, it's a snake. Another one feels a tusk and says, you're all absolutely wrong, it's a spear, etc. The point being that everybody, their reality, their perceptions are based on what is right in front of them, and very often they cannot see the forest for the trees, or is it the other way around? I don't know. But the point is that pretty much always we see a small part of the picture. And we think that that is our entire reality, or that is the reality for everyone, or should be the reality for everyone. And I bring this up in relationship with Swamiji because if you talk to people who knew him, if you read accounts of him, if you read stories that people tell about meeting him, you'll find that each one has a very, very different picture of who he is. So the summer Arjuna told a story about his encounter, his 6 years or more with Swamiji, and he and his wife were in the organization together. The wife was Kumari. Every time they would meet Swamiji, or Swamiji would say, oh, Kumari, how are you? How wonderful to see you again. You know, I enjoyed seeing you so much. And then he would turn to Arjuna and say, who are you with? Who's this? Or he'd tell people to do things, Rama, you do this, and Govinda, you do that, and you, what's your name? You, pointing to Arjuna. Now, he knew Arjuna's name, absolutely. But he related to Arjuna in a way that he needed. Arjuna had, and I dare say still has, a fairly large ego. And that needed to be suppressed. Other people, Swamiji would yell at. Other people, he would make a big fuss over. Other people, he, like Ruby, he would say, you, take out the garbage. Knowing that she was used to having people take out the garbage for her, and she needed to experience that kind of service. And something just clicked in her, and she said, I'm yours, forever and ever. And she was, until she died. I was just saying, there's a beautiful picture of her, and I can't remember, Greg took a beautiful picture of her, which I think he gave to the center. My relationship with Swamiji started, as I said, on Sunday when his book fell off the shelf and hit me on the head at a bookstore while I was putting other books away. And that was the end of the relationship. I mean, I read the book. I decided he was going to be my yoga teacher, primarily because he could do the asanas so well. There are pictures all over the center of his doing amazing things with his body, and I figured he looked like he knew what he was doing, and decided someday when I had the chance to go to India to be with him. And then when I hit a wall and reached this point of suffering, etc., 10 years later approximately, I decided this is the time to start learning yoga because I wasn't in India. I looked in the Yellow Pages in New York, found this organization, walked in the door, saw his picture, And then, even though I was told that the yoga camp word, it's a Yiddish word, means nerve, I had the nerve to go up there, and I was reading this book about Swamiji's first encounter with Sivananda, and he had a big ego, and he just wanted to meet him, but he was not going to bow down to him, because he didn't think everybody is equal, therefore you shouldn't bow. When he met Sivananda, he hid because he didn't want to bow to him. When he saw him, he hid. When Sivananda was walking by, Sivananda, seeing Swamiji and knowing what he needed, bowed to him. And the rest is, and then he said, stay. Actually, Swamiji was in the army, he had to go. Sivananda said, I want you here. He came back and he devoted the entire rest of his life to spreading the word of Sivananda, spreading the teachings of yoga and Vedanta, and establishing these centers, getting a cadre following of devoted followers with their wonderful employment package that I mentioned, getting people, and I can't stress enough how important it is to do karma yoga, to give of yourself, not just money. The place needs money. It has to, pay for electricity and sound equipment, etc. But more important, it runs on love. It runs on the service that is given selflessly by people like you all over the world. I've forgotten the other elephant story. Totally. I can remember a few. One's not appropriate. Anyway, questions? How are we doing for time? Keep going? Or not?
Yeah, we can continue.
Okay, what time do you want to stop?
Maybe 8.
Okay. Okay. By the way, I didn't finish talking. I talked about how Swamiji, what happened when he met Sivananda. When I met Vishnu Devananda, instead of his bowing down to me, he bought me an ice cream cone, along with everybody else on a silent walk. I said he gave me my mantra. He didn't really initiate me then, but he said to everybody, I scream, you scream for ice cream, which has been my mantra ever since, although sometimes I use occasionally, but I like ice cream. At any rate, during that summer, he asked me to fly with him as his co-pilot. I did later. It was a rather mind-blowing trip. The fact that we survived was fairly mind-blowing because neither of us had the knowledge, the experience, or the skill to do it, nor did the airplane really have the proper equipment or capabilities to do it. And I think it was a sign, I hate to use that word like a divine sign or something, but it was an indication of what can be accomplished when one has the devotion. The chutzpah helps, the devotion and the energy and the divine grace, if you will, that comes through the practice of yoga. There are all kinds of personal things that happened. It was not till, I believe, yesterday that somebody said that people who run these centers, a lot of the Swamis, never really got to spend that much personal time with Swamiji, and here I was, and it wasn't always, I didn't always consider it a blessing to be in a cockpit of an airplane about this wide with him for 70 hours and travel with him for 4 months. I mean, there were many times when I said, let me out of here, or we're going to crash if you don't do this, and he'd say, never mind, never mind. Eventually, we didn't crash. He usually listened to me. I think I mentioned taking off from Athens when the oil pressure started dropping, which is a very bad sign. It drops just before the airplane drops, and he started chanting Om Triambagam. I said, land first, chant later, and he listened to me. He didn't always listen to me, by the way. Sometimes we butted heads, but we got through it. The things that I remember the most, today I see the divinity, if you want to, I don't know what to call it, blessedness, divinity, holiness. I have always, and by the way, he talks about this when he met Sivananda. Sivananda said, let's sit by the river, and Swamiji's going, this has nothing to do, that's water, it's H2O. I studied chemistry, I studied physics. Why are we sitting by the water? It's just the river. And all of a sudden, everything became illuminated. So I've always had that kind of a skeptical, scientific, physically based way of looking at things, and flying with him, I must say, I was more concerned with the oil pressure gauge in that instance than I was in whether, God would keep us aloft. But the things I remember that made the deepest impression about him was his humor, his tirelessness in serving people, his tireless search for world peace and the eradication of borders, which he did not succeed in because his staff is constantly having problems with immigration. And by the way, I refer to myself as the token American, North American, token American, because everybody else here is from England, Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, France, etc., Israel. It's really amazing how this one man has created this worldwide network, bringing people from all over the world together to learn yoga, to improve themselves, and to sow the seeds of peace and help bring about a condition in which people learn to love each other and not have the need for war. By the way, I gave a talk probably 10 years ago in Canada, and I kept hearing people talking, and it was so disturbing. I thought, how can these people be so rude? It was people doing simultaneous translation in about 6 different languages. The energy in this organization is absolutely amazing. We have about 8 minutes. Please give me some questions so I don't have to keep trying to think of things to say, like the other elephant story, which I can't remember. Go ahead.
When you were flying around the world with Swamiji, I know you dropped pamphlets in places of conflict. What was the pamphlets? Were they from particular books, or what were they basically saying? And what were those experiences like in some of those conflicted areas?
We actually only dropped pamphlets in 2 places. One was in northern Belfast, which he talks about in this book. That was one of the instances where we butted heads. And the other was over the Suez Canal. What was in the pamphlets I haven't seen it here, but when you go, and also I haven't seen the whole Earth Passport by Peter Max. It'd be nice to have copies of that. When you walk into the yoga camp in Canada, one of the first things you'll see is a sign. I think it's on a little pagoda-like structure with the golden rule. Thou shalt do unto others as you would have them do unto you, as expressed by every religion.
Mm-hmm.
It's in every religion. Treat others the way you want to be treated. And in fact, I'll tell a story about that. One of the great Jewish, I'm not sure what he did, but he was a great, great Jewish scholar, rabbi, mystic. His name was Hillel, and to this day in universities, the Jewish Center is called the Hillel House. A wise ass, once a student of the Bible, who's sort of a wise ass, went up to him at one point and said, "If you're so great and so holy, I'd like to see you stand on one foot and recite the entire Torah, the 5 books of the Bible." And he stood on one foot and he said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." That is the whole of the teaching. Everything else is commentary. And I think that's true. So that was one of the things that was on the pamphlet. And I have to admit that I don't remember what else was. I do know there were messages about peace, about eradicating borders, the futility of war, how Vedanta teachings, I'm sure Om Namo Narayana was on that. And when we dropped them and marigolds over the Suez Canal, on the one side you had a large part of the Israeli army. On the other side were all of the Russian missiles that they'd given to Egypt to protect against Israeli invasion. And we dropped, there were no people, there were no soldiers on the other side. But we dropped them as we were flying over, and one of those, I mentioned Sunday, one of the leaflets landed at the foot of, on the head or near an Israeli soldier who read it and became inspired and joined this organization. Unfortunately, I cannot remember his name. And then about 10 years ago, I was invited to go with a group of the organization staff from California, and he was there were only about 10 of us, maybe, and he was one of those people. So I dropped this leaflet, he had read it, and it's probably more like 20 or 30 years later, probably 30 years later, I, at the very last minute, got invited around 11 o'clock, got invited to drive out to California in this yogi mobile. It was a mobile home with somebody doing the Cobra painted on it. And he was in it. And I was telling the story, he said, "I was underneath you when you dropped that." So that was part of the question, what was on the brochure? And the other part was where we dropped them.
Well, what was your experience like? But I'm curious, the last time you saw Swamiji, what did he say to you? And did he say anything about what the future would look like after the darkness passes through where it does?
Okay, let me finish the thing about the pamphlets. The other, and I may ask you again because I've got a small attention span. The other place we drop pamphlets, Peter Max, the comedian, actor, I keep talking about these things like Peter, I was talking about Peter Sellers. I talk about Peter Sellers, Peter Max, the Beatles movie, the Yellow Submarine, and nobody knows what it's before everybody's time. So anybody here has not seen Peter Max in, say, the Pink Panther, you're in for a treat. Has anybody not seen it? See, he did the last movie he made was with Shirley MacLaine, book by Jerzy Kosinski called Being There. But he's most famous for the Pink Panther series where he plays a bumbling French detective. In fact, they just remade some of them with Steve Martin, two of them at least. Plays a total idiot, bumbling French police detective who, through all of his bumbling, which actually is a little bit like Swamiji and I making this trip, doing everything wrong and ending up being alive. So Peter Sellers is always bumbling, does everything wrong, and always solves the crime, which drives his boss crazy. At any rate, he's a very, very funny man. On his birth, he was a tax exile. He's British, but he was living in Ireland, and he took us out to dinner. He took us to the home that he was living in, spent quite a bit of time with us, and when Swamiji found out it was his birthday, invited him to fly to Belfast with us to see Ian Paisley and tour around. And when we dropped the pamphlets out the window, okay, Swamiji wanted to drop them on their seat of government, be the equivalent of our capital. And Swamiji was not a good navigator, which is why he had me. Not that I was a great navigator. Today we just have a GPS. It'd be very, very simple. In those days it was not. And he saw this huge, big building, and he says, "That's it, drop the leaflets." I said, "No, Swamiji, it is not. That's 6 miles further on." Never mind. And he says, "Drop them now. Go ahead, drop." You know, and when he could be very, very forceful. Not a good, it was hard to argue with him, let's put it that way. Dropped them all out. Where we dropped them was a building project, an apartment house. And when we got to the airport, some of them, as they went out the window of the airplane, had stuck to the tail of the airplane. When we came to a stop and there was no air pressure, they fell to the runway, and the police zoomed in with a car, I don't know, to arrest us or to just give us a stern talking to or fine. But they started saying, you know, "What are you doing? You can't do this. It's totally illegal." And then they saw Peter Sellers and said, "Oh, you're Peter Sellers. What are you doing here?" And he put on an Indian. He was very, very talented with the doing a comedic Indian accent. And he did that, and they laughed, and that diffused the whole situation. The last time I did not see, after that trip, I ended up in Europe, the Caribbean. I bought a boat, crossed the Atlantic, was mostly traveling for about 22 years. So I lost touch with Swamiji. In 1986, I had a son born in Ireland, who's just had his 28th birthday. And I saw something, a poster about a yoga, Congress, convention classes. And I got the mother of my son and said, you know, let's go to this. She had to borrow a car. And my son at the time was probably about 4 months old. He was still in diapers. And we go, and of course, who's there? One guess. It was, okay, nobody's going to guess. It was Swamiji with a group of followers from Ireland. And I just kind of tucked myself into the back because I figured if he saw me, he'd give me a lot of things to do. Take out the garbage. And he talked, and as everybody was getting up, he spotted me and made a huge fuss and said, you know, you have to stay. And I said, you know, I've got this baby, we've got no diapers, the car